The Tactical Defense Academy's armor fabrication chamber hummed with the focused energy of 67 species working in concentrated silence. Crystalline beings from Xerion Prime methodically assembled their traditional light refractive shields, their faceted bodies catching and bending the overhead illumination into prismatic patterns. The hulking Graxians welded titanium composite plates with their bare claws, sparks cascading off their natural keratin armor. Slender Vashti floated 3 feet above their workstations, weaving energy filaments into gossamer barriers that could deflect plasma bolts. David Lawson sat cross-legged on the floor in the far corner, surrounded by a growing fortress of books, ancient leather-bound volumes, digital tablets displaying scrolling text, holographic manuscripts that flickered with alien scripts, and even primitive paper notebooks formed concentric circles around him like medieval castle walls. The other cadets had long since stopped pretending not to stare. "Is the human reading?" whispered Zethkar, a 6-armed Chronari whose species had perfected molecular shield technology 3 millennia before humans discovered fire. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been confusion or contempt. "Typical primitive behavior," rumbled Vorthak, his massive Graxian frame casting a shadow over half the workshop. "Their species lacks the proper instincts for survival. No natural armor, no energy manipulation, no enhanced reflexes. They compensate with stories." The assignment was straightforward: create personal armor using any materials, techniques, or technologies available in the Academy's vast fabrication facility. Each species was expected to demonstrate their unique approach to protection, drawing upon millions of years of evolutionary adaptation and thousands of years of technological development. The resulting armor would be tested in 3 days during the Academy's most challenging simulation, the Gauntlet of Worlds, where cadets faced combat scenarios from across known galactic history. David turned another page of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, occasionally making notes in the margins with an archaic stylus. Beside him lay stacks of military history texts, philosophical treatises on conflict resolution, technical manuals on xenobiology, linguistic guides to 47 different species, psychological studies on fear and intimidation, and what appeared to be several volumes of poetry. The eclectic collection drew puzzled glances from his classmates, who were busy crafting armor that could withstand particle beams and kinetic projectiles. Instructor Veltar, a towering hegemony official whose species had conquered 17 star systems through superior military technology, approached David's corner with measured steps. Her elongated skull gleamed under the workshop lights, and her 4 eyes fixed on the human with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. Cadet Lawson, her voice carried the harmonic undertones that made hegemony speech sound like a combination of music and threat. "Other students are forging protection. You are studying." David looked up from his book, meeting her gaze without flinching. Something in his steady brown eyes made several nearby aliens pause in their work. "Yes, ma'am. I'm preparing my armor. Your armor appears to be composed entirely of information storage devices." "That's correct." Veltar's secondary arms gestured toward the impressive displays of technology around the workshop. Holographic forges created custom alloys, molecular assemblers built materials atom by atom, and energy weavers spun force fields into solid barriers. The fabrication facility contains resources worth more than most planetary defense budgets. You could craft protection capable of withstanding direct bombardment from a battlecruiser. "I could," David agreed, returning to his book, "but I won't need to." The conversation had drawn the attention of most of the workshop. 66 pairs of alien eyes watched this exchange with varying degrees of interest, amusement, and disdain. Among them was Thisara, a Vashti whose graceful form seemed to dance even while standing still. Her species valued elegant solutions and artistic expression, and she found herself oddly intrigued by the human's unconventional approach. "Perhaps," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The human sees something we do not. His species is known for creativity. His species is known for self-destruction, countered Korthek, a heavily augmented cyborg from the Mechanicus Collective. His red optical sensors focused on David with mechanical precision. They wage war against themselves with religious fervor. They create weapons capable of destroying their own world. They are chaos incarnate. David looked up again, this time with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Chaos can be useful, he said quietly, then returned to his reading. The workshop fell silent, except for the hum of fabrication equipment. Something in the human's tone had shifted the atmosphere, though none of the aliens could quite identify what had changed. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees, or the air pressure had suddenly increased. Commander Zaris, the Academy's head of tactical studies, entered the workshop for his daily inspection. The Torgan military officer stood nearly 8 feet tall, his natural exoskeleton polished to mirror brightness. His species had built the most successful interstellar military in known history through discipline, technology, and an unwavering belief in the superiority of force. He surveyed the workshop with the cold efficiency of a predator evaluating prey. "Impressive work," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally commanded fleets in 17 major conflicts. "I see innovations that would be valuable additions to Galactic Defense Force standard equipment." His gaze fell on David's corner, and his 4 mandibles spread in what passed for a Torgan expression of disgust. "Except for this. Cadet Lawson, explain your methodology." David closed his book, keeping one finger between the pages to mark his place. "Knowledge is the most effective armor, sir. It stops more bullets than steel. Is that supposed to be some kind of human philosophy?" Commander Zaris's compound eyes fixed on David with predatory focus. "Poetry has never stopped a plasma bolt, hasn't it?" David's question was quiet, almost conversational. Sun Tzu prevented more battles than he fought. Gandhi's words dismantled an empire without firing a shot. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the course of history with speeches. Von Clausewitz's theories shaped military doctrine for centuries. Knowledge doesn't just stop bullets, Commander. It makes people decide not to fire them in the first place. The workshop had gone completely silent. Even the fabrication equipment seemed to pause in its humming. 66 alien cadets watched this human challenge one of the most decorated military commanders in galactic history with nothing but words and the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Commander Zaris stepped closer, his massive frame casting David in shadow. "Pretty words, human. But the Gauntlet of Worlds doesn't respond to speeches. It responds to superior firepower and unbreachable defenses. You will face simulated combat scenarios based on real historical conflicts. Torganian raiders who glass planets from orbit. Hegemony shock troops who have never lost a ground engagement. Xerion crystal warriors who move at light speed. Your books will not save you." David stood slowly, the movement fluid and controlled. He was at least 2 feet shorter than the Torgan commander, but something in his posture made the height difference seem irrelevant. "With respect, sir, my books already have." "Explain." "You mentioned Torganian raiders, hegemony shock troops, and Xerion crystal warriors. I've spent the last 72 hours studying every available record of their tactics, psychology, and cultural behaviors. I know that Torganian raiders consider ground combat beneath their dignity and will retreat if forced into prolonged close-quarters engagement. Hegemony shock troops rely on psychological intimidation and become confused when their opponents don't show expected fear responses. Xerion crystal warriors move at light speed, but think at the speed of silicon-based consciousness, which means their reaction time is actually slower than most biological species. The silence in the workshop had taken on a different quality. It was no longer the silence of creatures watching entertainment. It was the silence of predators recognizing another predator. Furthermore, David continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. "I know that Torgans value honor above victory and will accept surrender if it's offered according to their ritual protocols. I know that hegemony forces have a cultural blind spot regarding small unit tactics because their society is based on hierarchical mass coordination. I know that Xerian crystal warriors can be temporarily blinded by specific light frequencies that cause harmonic resonance in their crystalline structure." Commander Xerus had gone very still, his compound eyes reflecting the workshop lights like dark mirrors. Around the room, alien cadets exchanged glances, filled with a dawning realization that perhaps they had underestimated their human classmate. "And you learned all this from books." Books, historical records, cultural studies, battle reports, psychological profiles, even poetry and music from different species. Every piece of information is a weapon if you know how to use it. David gestured toward his fortress of literature. "This isn't just armor, Commander. It's an arsenal." The Torgan commander studied David for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We shall see, Cadet Lawson. We shall see." As Commander Xerus left the workshop, the other cadets gradually returned to their projects, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Several aliens cast speculative glances toward David, who had settled back into his cross-legged position and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. Thisara drifted closer, her energy weaving temporarily forgotten. "What are you reading now?" she asked. David held up the book so she could see the cover. "The Influence of Sea Power Upon History" by Alfred Thahan Mahan. Human naval strategy from the pre-spaceflight era. And this helps you understand galactic combat how. Every species fights the way they think. Humans developed naval strategy because we're planet-bound creatures who learn to cross water. But the principles translate. Control the high ground, secure your supply lines, force your enemy to fight on your terms rather than theirs. David turned a page. Torgans think like aerial predators. They prefer to strike from above and withdraw quickly. Hegemony forces think like hive insects. They coordinate through central command structures. Xerions think like living crystals. They process information in harmonics and patterns. So you study human military theory to understand alien psychology? I study everything to understand everything. David closed the book and reached for another one. That's what knowledge is, the ability to see connections that others miss. Your people weave energy into solid barriers. That's impressive. But I weave information into tactical advantages, and information never breaks. 3 days later, the Gauntlet of Worlds simulation facility buzzed with anticipation. The arena was a massive holographic chamber capable of recreating any environment from across the galaxy, from the crystalline caves of Xerion Prime to the plasma storms of the Hegemony homeworld. Spectators filled the observation galleries. Instructors, upper-class cadets, and even some visiting dignitaries from the Galactic Defense Force. David entered his staging area, carrying nothing but a single, worn paperback book. The other cadets emerged in their carefully crafted armor. Zethkar's Chronari molecular shields shimmered with rainbow interference patterns. Vorthak's Graxian titanium composite plates could probably stop a starship's main gun, and Thisara's energy barriers pulsed with enough power to light a small city. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings, announced the arena's AI controller. Welcome to the Gauntlet of Worlds. Each cadet will face 3 randomly selected combat scenarios from galactic military history. Victory conditions vary by scenario, but all require survival and mission completion. First scenario, Torganian Orbital Raid, Kepler 442b, Galactic Standard Year 2387. The arena transformed into the surface of a contested mining world. Rocky terrain stretched in all directions under a blood-red sky, while overhead, the distinctive silhouettes of Torganian raiding vessels hung like metallic vultures. The simulation was so realistic that several spectators instinctively ducked as plasma bolts began raining from the sky. Zethkar was first. Her molecular shields deflected the initial bombardment with contemptuous ease, and she began a systematic advance toward the designated extraction point. The Torganian ships responded by increasing their fire rate, turning the landscape into a hellscape of superheated rock and glass. She made it halfway before a concentrated barrage overwhelmed her defenses, and the simulation ended with the harsh tone that indicated mission failure. Vorthak lasted longer. His armor absorbed punishment that would have vaporized most beings, and his species' natural aggression served him well in the hostile environment. But Torgans were aerial specialists. They had been conducting orbital bombardments for millennia. Eventually, even Graxian endurance had its limits, and he fell just short of the extraction point. One by one, cadets entered the simulation. Some failed quickly, others put up impressive fights, but none managed to complete the mission. The Torganian orbital raid was specifically designed to be nearly impossible, a test of how well cadets could adapt when faced with overwhelming odds. Finally, David's turn arrived. He walked calmly to the center of the arena, plasma bolts already falling around him like deadly rain. Instead of running toward the extraction point, he did something that made every spectator lean forward in their seats. He sat down, opened his book, and began to read. The plasma bombardment continued for 30 seconds. Then, gradually, it began to slow. The Torganian ships, following their programmed behavioral algorithms based on real historical data, were confused by this unprecedented response. Their targeting systems were designed to track moving opponents, not stationary ones who showed no fear or aggression. David stood up, closed his book, and called out in perfect Torganian, his voice carrying clearly across the simulated battlefield. Ships of the Sky Clans, I invoke the right of contemplative challenge as established under the Treaty of Voranus Prime. The bombardment stopped entirely. From the observation galleries came a collective intake of breath. The Treaty of Voranus Prime was an obscure piece of interspecies law, nearly forgotten except by the most dedicated scholars of galactic diplomacy. It granted any being the right to request single combat with a Torganian commander rather than face mass bombardment, but only if the request was made according to specific ritual protocols that virtually no non-Torgans knew. A holographic Torganian commander materialized on the battlefield, his ceremonial armor gleaming with the marks of high rank. You know the old words, ground crawler, but do you understand their meaning? I understand that your honor demands you accept, Skylord. David's pronunciation was flawless, his tone respectful but not subservient. I understand that single combat grants the winner the right to claim victory for their side, regardless of numbers or firepower. And you believe you can defeat a Torganian warrior in single combat? The commander's mandibles spread in anticipation. David smiled. I believe I can defeat you without fighting at all. What happened next would be discussed in xenomilitary academies for decades to come. David began to speak, still in Torganian, weaving together historical references, cultural observations, and what could only be described as poetry. He spoke of the Torganian concept of honor, of their ancient traditions, of the weight of command, and the loneliness of leadership. He spoke of battles fought and won, of sacrifices made in the name of clan and sky, but most importantly, he spoke of how the Torganian commander's current mission, bombarding helpless ground targets, was beneath the warrior's true nature. He painted a picture of what the commander could be, a teacher, a guide, a bridge between the old ways and the new galaxy that was emerging around them. The holographic Torganian stood motionless for several minutes after David finished speaking. Finally, slowly, he removed his ceremonial helmet and placed it on the ground between them. You have won this combat without striking a blow, human. Your words carry the weight of wisdom. The commander's voice carried a note of wonder. I declare this engagement concluded in your favor. The simulation ended with the tone that indicated mission success. The second scenario began immediately. Hegemony Shock Assault, Fortress Europa, GSY 2334. The arena became a maze of corridors and defensive positions, filled with the distinctive energy signatures of hegemony warriors. These were the elite troops that had conquered 17 star systems through superior coordination and overwhelming psychological pressure. Other cadets had attempted various approaches: stealth, direct assault, defensive positioning. All had failed when faced with the hegemony's perfectly coordinated attack patterns and their ability to break enemy morale through targeted psychological warfare. David entered the maze and immediately began laughing. It was not the laughter of madness or desperation. It was the warm, genuine laughter of someone who had just heard a particularly good joke. The sound echoed through the corridors with infectious humanity, and the hegemony forces faltered. Their psychological warfare techniques were designed to exploit fear, anger, and despair, not joy. Contact confirmed, human designation, came the synthesized voice of a hegemony commander. Surrender is inevitable. Resistance will result in enhanced pain protocols. Enhanced pain protocols? David's laughter grew louder. Oh, that's adorable. You know what humans call enhanced pain protocols? Tuesday morning, he began moving through the maze, still chuckling, and as he moved, he began to tell jokes. Human jokes, specifically. Absurd, irreverent, often dark humor that completely derailed the hegemony's psychological conditioning. Their warriors were trained to respond to threats, intimidation, and fear. They had no programming for dealing with someone who found their most terrifying pronouncements genuinely funny. Why did the hegemony warrior cross the space-time continuum? David called out as he navigated the corridors. To get to the other side. His laughter was so contagious that several spectators in the observation gallery began smiling despite themselves. The hegemony forces became increasingly confused as their target not only refused to show fear, but seemed to be actively enjoying himself. Their coordination began to break down as individual warriors started hesitating, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented situation. David reached the mission objective, a simulated command center, still grinning. As hegemony reinforcements converged on his position, he did something that would become legendary in Academy folklore. He began telling them about human history, specifically the parts involving bureaucracy. You know what your entire civilization reminds me of? The Department of Motor Vehicles from pre-spaceflight Earth. Same obsession with forms in triplicate. Same belief that proper procedure can solve any problem. Same complete inability to handle anyone who doesn't follow the script. The hegemony commander materialized in the center of the chamber, his form towering and intimidating. Your words are meaningless. Your resistance is futile. See, that's exactly what I mean. David pointed at the commander with delighted recognition. That phrase right there. Resistance is futile. Do you know how many human fictional villains have said exactly those words? We've been making fun of that particular brand of arrogant certainty for centuries. You're not terrifying, you're a trope. The psychological effect on the hegemony forces was devastating. Their entire tactical doctrine was based on presenting themselves as an inevitable, irresistible force. But David's genuine amusement at their methods stripped away their mystique and revealed them as what they truly were: bureaucrats with weapons. The simulation ended with another mission success tone. The third and final scenario loaded. Xerion Crystal Maze, Battle of Prism Station, GSY 2298. This was considered the most challenging of all possible simulations. The arena became a shifting labyrinth of crystalline structures that reflected and refracted light in impossible ways. Xerion crystal warriors moved through this environment at near light speed, their forms barely visible as they darted between reflective surfaces. Previous cadets had tried everything: brute force attacks that shattered harmlessly against living crystal, energy weapons that were simply absorbed and redirected, even attempts at stealth that failed against beings who could see across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. David entered the crystal maze carrying his book and walking at a perfectly normal human pace. The Zarian warriors materialized around him like living prisms, their forms beautiful and deadly as they caught and scattered the ambient light. Human entity detected. Their harmonic voices created complex interference patterns in the air. State your purpose in the sacred geometry. Instead of answering, David sat down in the center of the maze and began to hum. It was a simple melody, something that might have been a lullaby or a folk song. But as the tune echoed through the crystalline passages, something extraordinary happened. The Zarian warriors began to slow down. Their light-speed movement became merely fast, then normal, then almost sluggish. David had discovered something that even Zarian experts didn't fully understand. Their consciousness operated on harmonic frequencies, and the right sound could disrupt their temporal perception. But more than that, the melody he was humming contained mathematical ratios that resonated with their crystalline structure in a way that induced something very much like nostalgia. "The old songs," whispered one of the warriors, his voice carrying harmonics of wonder and memory. "How do you know the old songs of our people?" David stopped humming and opened his book. "I've been studying Zarian cultural archaeology. Your species developed music before language, harmony before mathematics. This melody appears in your oldest preserved records, not as a weapon or a tool, but as a reminder of home." He stood slowly, the book still open in his hands. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to remember with you." What followed was perhaps the most unprecedented moment in Academy history. David began to recite Zarian poetry, verses that dated back millions of years when their species first achieved consciousness. His pronunciation was imperfect, his human vocal cords unable to produce the full harmonic range, but the meaning came through clearly. The crystal warriors gathered around him in a circle, their forms pulsing with soft light as they added their own voices to his recitation. Together, human and Zarians created a harmony that transformed the deadly maze into something approaching a sacred space. "You understand us," said the lead warrior when the poetry ended. "Not our tactics or our weaknesses, but us." "Understanding is the point," David replied. "Not victory, not dominance, not even survival. Understanding." The warrior approached him, moving now at normal speed, his crystalline form catching the light in patterns that seemed almost like smiles. "The sacred geometry opens for those who walk the path of comprehension. Pass, human friend, pass with honor." The simulation ended with the mission success tone, but also with something else: spontaneous applause from the observation galleries. Instructors who had maintained professional detachment for decades found themselves standing and clapping. Even Commander Zaris, his compound eyes reflecting the arena lights, was slowly bringing his four hands together in the Torgan gesture of deep respect. In the post-simulation debriefing chamber, David sat exactly as he had in the workshop 3 days earlier, cross-legged, book in hand, surrounded by piles of literature. But now the other cadets approached him differently. There was no mockery, no dismissal, only a kind of awed curiosity. "How?" asked Zethkar, her 6 arms spread in a gesture of bewilderment. "How did you defeat 3 impossible scenarios without firing a shot, without advanced armor, without any of the tools we thought were necessary?" David looked up from his book, a collection of Vashti philosophical essays, he noted with interest. "I didn't defeat them. I understood them. Once you understand someone, fighting becomes unnecessary." Thisara settled into a graceful float beside him. "But surely there must be more to it than that. You used specific knowledge, precise cultural references, exact protocols." "Knowledge is a tool like any other," David agreed, "but it's only as good as the wisdom behind it. I didn't memorize facts about Torgans, hegemony, and Zarians so I could exploit their weaknesses. I studied them so I could recognize their strengths, appreciate their perspectives, Find the common ground. Vorthak's massive frame cast a shadow over the group, but his voice carried none of its earlier contempt. And this is typical human strategy? David's laugh was softer now, more thoughtful. Actually, it's the exact opposite of typical human strategy. We're usually terrible at this kind of thing. We fight first and ask questions later, if at all. We're violent, impulsive, prideful, and we have a tendency to shoot anything we don't understand. Then why? Because someone has to learn to be better. David closed his book and looked around the circle of alien faces. Every species has its strengths. Torgans have honor. Hegemony has coordination. Xerians have harmony. Humans have the ability to change. We're the only species I know of that can look at our own worst instincts and consciously choose to become something else. Commander Xeris entered the debriefing chamber, his presence immediately commanding attention. He surveyed the assembled cadets, then focused his compound gaze on David. "Cadet Lawson, your performance today was unprecedented." "Thank you, sir. It was also completely contrary to established tactical doctrine. You achieved victory through methods that cannot be easily replicated or standardized. This presents certain difficulties for military training protocols." David nodded. "Yes, sir. I imagine it does." "Which is why," Commander Xeris continued, "the Galactic Defense Force has decided to create a new position, Cultural Liaison and Conflict Resolution Specialist. It appears we need someone who can win wars by preventing them from happening in the first place." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Galactic Defense Force was essentially acknowledging that their most effective warrior was someone who refused to fight. "Will you accept this position, Cadet Lawson?" David considered the question, absently running his fingers along the spine of his book. Around him, 66 alien classmates waited for his answer, their earlier dismissal replaced by something approaching reverence. "Only if I can bring my books," he said finally. Commander Xeris's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. "I believe that can be arranged." Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of galactic diplomacy, they would point to this moment as the beginning of a new era. The human who wrapped himself in knowledge instead of armor became the template for a new kind of warrior, one who fought with understanding rather than weapons, who achieved victory through connection rather than conquest. But in that debriefing chamber, surrounded by the warm hum of conversation as aliens and human began to truly see each other for the first time, David Lawson simply opened another book and continued reading. There was still so much to learn, so many perspectives to understand, so many connections to make. After all, knowledge didn't just stop more bullets than steel. It stopped the need for bullets altogether. And that, he thought as he turned the page, was the most human thing of all, the ability to imagine a better way and the stubborn determination to make it real.